Al Capone didn't take Chicago alone. He survived it. Before the myth hardened, there were three men standing in his way, each dangerous in a different way. Dean O'Banion broke every agreement and destabilized the entire system. Hymie Weiss came within seconds of killing Capone himself. Bugs Moran lived long enough to watch everyone else die and lost everything anyway. This isn't the story of how Capone won. It's the story of how close he came to losing and what it cost everyone involved. You are listening to Deadly Truths, and I'm Becca. This is The Mob is Dead. Before Chicago knew him as a corpse in a flower shop, Dean O'Banion was a South Side Irish kid who learned early that charm and cruelty traveled well together. Born in 1892 in Chicago to Irish immigrants, O'Banion grew up in the gritty overlap between immigrant survival and street-level opportunism. His world wasn't shaped by ideology or loyalty. It was shaped by access. Who controlled the block? Who paid off the cops? Who could move liquor, guns, or money without getting pinched? O'Banion absorbed that logic young, and unlike many of his peers, he understood something critical. Violence worked best when paired with unpredictability. He wasn't physically imposing. He didn't rely on brute force the way Italian or Jewish crews often did. O'Banion's real weapon was instability. He smiled easily, sang Irish ballads, and played the warm neighborhood operator. But behind that facade was a man who treated agreements as temporary suggestions. That made him dangerous. O'Banion entered organized crime through petty theft and street rackets, then graduated into bootlegging as Prohibition opened the floodgates. While other gangs tried to formalize territory and negotiate boundaries, O'Banion did the opposite. He made deals he never intended to keep. He hijacked shipments after shaking hands. He sold liquor routes to rivals knowing he'd sabotage them days later. This wasn't impulsive behavior, it was strategy. O'Banion understood that if he could break the system faster than anyone could stabilize it, he would always have leverage. One of the least talked about facts about O'Banion is how deliberately he used law enforcement pressure as a weapon. He cultivated police protection not to shield himself, but to expose others. He tipped off authorities about rival operations, timed raids to coincide with competitors' shipments, and used arrests as just another form of sabotage. He didn't just break rules, he weaponized the rules themselves. If you were looking for danger, Dean O'Banion would not have caught your eye. He looked ordinary, respectable even, medium height, solid build, but not hulking. His face was rounder than sharp, with soft features that made him seem approachable rather than threatening. Light-colored hair, neatly parted, clean-shaven, the kind of man you'd expect to see behind a counter, not behind a hit. He dressed well, tailored suits, pressed shirts, ties knotted carefully, nothing flashy, nothing that screamed power. In photographs, he often appears relaxed, faintly amused, sometimes smiling. Not the smile of a bully or a brute, the smile of someone comfortable in the room. That was the trick. O'Banion looked like a businessman because he was one. He owned a flower shop. He handled customers. He attended social events. Cops didn't stiffen when he walked by. Politicians didn't feel exposed shaking his hand. Nothing about him warned you. He could stand close without raising alarms. He could make deals without signaling threat. He could betray you without ever changing his tone. The violence didn't show on his face. It stayed hidden behind civility and charm. Where others ruled by fear, O'Banion ruled by misdirection. By the time people realized who he really was, the damage had already been done. O'Banion is often remembered as Capone's rival. But that's too clean. Rivals want to win. O'Banion wanted to disrupt. He didn't need to control Chicago. He needed to make sure no one else could either. That philosophy made him impossible to coexist with. By the early 1920s, every major outfit in Chicago had the same conclusion. As long as Dean O'Banion was alive, there would be no stability, no lasting profits, no end to the pressure. He wasn't just bad for business, he was bad for survival. That's not all either. Most people who know his name from mob history know about his flower shop. The shop gave O'Banion clean income, social credibility, and a reason to interact with politicians, cops, and businessmen without raising suspicion. Florists weren't threatening, they were useful. O'Banion often sent flowers to the funerals of men he had ordered killed, sometimes with friendly notes. It wasn't sentimentality, it was intimidation wrapped in politeness, a reminder that he was present, watching, and untouchable. Dean O'Banion didn't stumble into war with the South Side. He engineered it. By the early 1920s, Dean O'Banion understood exactly how Johnny Torrio's operation worked. Torrio valued stability, predictable territory, quiet profits, violence only when absolutely necessary. That restraint was the system's weak point, and O'Banion knew it. So he attacked the system without firing a shot. O'Banion repeatedly made agreements with Johnny Torrio knowing he would break them. He sold Torrio bad information. He promised cooperation, then sabotaged shipments. He hijacked liquor convoys after shaking hands, forcing Torrio to either absorb losses or retaliate publicly, something Torrio hated. Each betrayal was calculated. When Torrio tried to respond through intermediaries, O'Banion escalated. He used police pressure as a weapon, tipping off authorities about Southside operations while keeping his own insulated. Raids landed on Torrio's warehouses at precisely the wrong times. Arrests disrupted supply chains, money stopped moving, and then O'Banion made it personal. He set Torrio up with a brewery deal he knew was doomed. Torrio invested heavily, only to watch O'Banion tip off the police, triggering a raid that destroyed the operation and left Torrio exposed to prosecution. The message was unmistakable. I can hurt you without touching you. That was the bait. Torrio understood what O'Banion was doing. The problem was that ignoring him wasn't an option. Every move O'Banion made increased scrutiny, instability, and financial loss. If Torrio didn't act, his entire operation would collapse under pressure. If he did act, he risked open war. That's when Al Capone entered the equation. Capone didn't see O'Banion as a destabilizer. He saw him as an insult. Where Torrio hesitated, Capone pushed. He viewed O'Banion's betrayals not as strategic pressure, but as weakness, masquerading as cleverness. Capone believed fear could still restore order, and that eliminating O'Banion would reset the board. That's exactly what O'Banion wanted. By forcing Torrio into a corner and provoking Capone's aggression, O'Banion ensured the conflict would escalate beyond negotiation. He knew Torrio's restraint had limits. He knew Capone's didn't, and he understood that once blood was spilled, there would be no going back to quiet agreements. O'Banion didn't underestimate Torrio and Capone. He counted on them reacting exactly as they did. The tragedy is that his strategy worked, just not long enough to save him. Because once O'Banion crossed from disruption into humiliation, Torrio concluded there was only one way to restore stability. And that decision would ignite a war no one could control. Dean O'Banion had pushed too far, too deliberately, for too long. The betrayals weren't rumors anymore. They were losses measured in seized liquor, ruined investments, and mounting police pressure. Stability was gone. Torrio understood something had to give. On the morning of November 10, 1924, O'Banion followed his routine. He was inside his flower shop on Chicago's North Side, surrounded by the symbols of his double life. Fresh arrangements waiting for delivery, the smell of cut stems and damp greenery hanging in the air. The shop was calm, familiar, safe in the way routine always feels safe, right up until it isn't. 3 men entered. They weren't strangers. That was the point. O'Banion recognized them and stepped forward, extending his hand in greeting. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't flinch. Years of operating in plain sight had trained him to trust civility, even when it came from rivals. The flower shop was neutral ground, or so he believed. As he leaned in, one of the men seized his hand, holding him in place. Another raised a gun. The shots came fast, close, unmistakable. Bullets tore into O'Banion's body at point-blank range, shattering the illusion that charm and unpredictability could shield him forever. He collapsed among overturned flowers and broken glass, the violence brutally out of place in a room designed for mourning and celebration. He was dead before help arrived. The killers walked out. No chase followed, no arrests stuck. Witnesses remembered pieces, not enough to matter. The city absorbed the murder the way it absorbed so many others, quietly, selectively, and with practiced indifference. The symbolism was unmistakable. O'Banion, who had used funerals as a stage and flowers as psychological warfare, was killed in the very space that had made him untouchable. The shop that gave him legitimacy also gave his enemies certainty. Torrio believed this would end the war. He was wrong. O'Banion's death didn't restore order, it detonated it. What had been strategic sabotage turned into personal vengeance. Leadership passed not to a negotiator, but to a man who understood only escalation. And that man was Hymie Weiss. O'Banion's murder didn't close the book on Chicago's gang war. It tore the cover off. When you strip away the gunfights and mythology, Dean O'Banion stands out not because he was violent, but because of how he used other people's violence. O'Banion's behavior shows a consistent psychological pattern: instrumental manipulation. He didn't lie impulsively. He lied strategically. He broke agreements not because he lacked impulse control, but because he viewed commitments as tools rather than obligations. Deals existed to be exploited, not honored. That points to a personality structure built around control through destabilization. O'Banion demonstrated high cognitive empathy, the ability to accurately read motivations, predict reactions, and anticipate escalation. He understood Torrio's need for stability, Capone's sensitivity to disrespect, and law enforcement's selective enforcement. He used that understanding to push others into predictable responses while keeping his own hands clean. At the same time, he showed low effective empathy. There's no evidence that the human cost of his actions slowed him down. People being arrested, injured, or killed were variables in a system, not moral limits. That combination, high insight, low inhibition, is what makes manipulators effective and dangerous. His repeated deal-breaking also suggests sensation tolerance. O'Banion appeared unusually comfortable operating under constant threat. Rather than seeking safety, he created volatility because volatility kept others off balance. Chaos wasn't a byproduct of his strategy. It was the environment in which he felt most powerful. Psychologically, this often reflects overconfidence reinforced by early success. Each betrayal that didn't immediately cost him his life strengthened the belief that he could always outmaneuver consequences. Protection from police and social legitimacy reinforced this illusion, giving him a false sense of insulation. Another key trait was provocative dominance. O'Banion didn't just compete, he humiliated. He set rivals up in ways that forced them to either absorb losses publicly or retaliate visibly. This wasn't accidental. It allowed him to dictate the tempo of conflict while framing himself as the reasonable party. O'Banion's psychology depended on others choosing stability over finality. He assumed Torrio would continue prioritizing order even at personal cost. That assumption held until it didn't. Once Torrio reframed O'Banion as an existential threat rather than a business problem, O'Banion's entire psychological model collapsed. O'Banion believed chaos could be controlled indefinitely as long as he stayed one step ahead. He underestimated the moment when someone would decide that ending the chaos was worth any cost. That's the psychological trap of manipulators who thrive on instability. Eventually, someone stops playing the game. If you're looking for a modern parallel, don't think of a killer. Think of someone who thrives on destabilization, someone who breaks agreements not because they forget them, but because they believe they can control the fallout. That's the psychology O'Banion was operating from. When Dean O'Banion died on the floor of his flower shop, the North Side didn't retreat. it hardened. Leadership didn't pass to a negotiator or a stabilizer. It passed to a man who understood exactly what O'Banion's death meant and what it demanded in return. That man was Hymie Weiss. Where O'Banion thrived on disruption, Weiss believed in resolution. He wasn't interested in baiting rivals or manipulating systems. He believed the war could only end one way, by removing the men at the top. O'Banion's murder didn't scare Weiss. It clarified his objective. From this point on, the conflict stopped being strategic and became surgical. Deals no longer mattered. Warnings were over. Weiss didn't want leverage. He wanted heads. And for the first time, Al Capone wasn't just challenged, he was hunted. If Dean O'Banion was chaos, Hymie Weiss was consequence. Weiss was born Henry Wojciechowski in Chicago in 1898, the son of Polish-Jewish immigrants. Hymie is often remembered as a Chicago gangster, but that only tells half the story. He was born in Chicago, yet formed in New York, where he spent crucial years in the city's harsher, more organized underworld. New York gangs emphasized coordination, discipline, and leadership targeting long before Chicago did, and Weiss absorbed that thinking early. By the time he returned to Chicago, he wasn't operating on local instinct alone. He was bringing a different criminal education with him. In a city still learning how modern organized crime worked, Weiss was already playing a more evolved game. Weiss didn't come up through charm or legitimacy. He came up through street discipline. Dean O'Banion is the one who brought Hymie Weiss fully into the Chicago underworld. Weiss didn't arrive in Chicago as an outsider looking for opportunity. He returned because of Dean O'Banion. The two already knew each other, and O'Banion recognized Weiss as something rare, disciplined, reliable, and willing to enforce outcomes without ego. O'Banion needed muscle he could trust, not chaos he had to manage. Weiss became that man. He wasn't just recruited, he was positioned, first as an enforcer, then as a stabilizer, and eventually as the North Side's most capable strategist. He was not a lieutenant in name, but in function. Where O'Banion manipulated systems, Weiss enforced outcomes. He wasn't the face of the operation, he was the spine. Weiss didn't look like he was playing a part. He looked hard. Medium height, lean, compact, narrow face, sharp eyes. Photographs show a man who rarely smiled. Not because he was humorless, but because he didn't perform. His posture is tight, controlled, and alert. The kind of man who looks like he's always listening for footsteps. He dressed neatly but plainly. No flash, no excess. Unlike Capone, Weiss didn't cultivate visibility. He didn't need witnesses. If O'Banion blended in, Weiss stood apart. Not loud enough to attract attention, not soft enough to invite underestimation. Weiss believed violence should be targeted, decisive, and final. No baiting, no theatrics, no symbolic warnings. He focused on leadership removal, not territorial skirmishes. This wasn't bravado. Weiss represents the moment the Chicago gang war stopped being about profit and became about survival. Under O'Banion, chaos was leverage. Under Weiss, violence became directional. Hymie Weiss didn't need time to think. When Dean O'Banion was murdered, Weiss understood something immediately that others didn't. This wasn't a warning shot. It was an attempt to end the war by removing instability. So Weiss responded the only way that made sense to him. He aimed higher. Johnny Torrio wasn't just Capone's boss. He was the architect of the South Side operation, the strategist, the man who believed violence should be limited, contained, and used sparingly to preserve order. As long as Torrio was alive, Capone had restraint above him. Weiss intended to remove that restraint or collapse the entire structure with it. Unlike O'Banion, Weiss didn't bait or manipulate. He didn't play games. He selected his targets, studied routine, and waited for certainty. This wasn't retaliation for pride. It was a calculated leadership strike. In January 1925, Weiss's gunmen ambushed Torrio outside his home. There was no confrontation, no warning, just gunfire at close range. Torrio was hit multiple times. He collapsed in the street, bleeding heavily, left for dead. Weiss didn't need confirmation. In his world, the hit itself was the message. The rules are gone. But Torrio didn't die. He survived, barely. And that survival changed everything. Torrio understood the implication immediately. This wasn't a gang skirmish anymore. This was personal, irreversible, and escalating beyond anything he had built his career trying to avoid. Weiss had crossed a line Torrio never intended to cross himself. Recovery gave Torrio clarity. If he stayed, the war would continue until one side was annihilated. There would be no return to quiet profits or negotiated boundaries. And if he stayed in charge, Capone would continue to escalate in ways Torrio could no longer control. So Torrio made a decision Weiss hadn't anticipated. He walked away. Within months, Torrio withdrew from Chicago, effectively retiring and leaving the operation behind. Not out of fear, but out of recognition. He saw that the environment he once managed through restraint no longer existed. It cleared the path for someone far more dangerous. And that someone was Al Capone. Hymie Weiss believed removing Johnny Torrio would collapse the South Side. On paper, it made sense. Torrio was the strategist, the restraint, the man who believed violence should be limited because profit depended on stability. Take him out, and the structure should fail. But Weiss misread the vacuum. Torrio's restraint wasn't a weakness, it was a governor. It slowed escalation. It absorbed pressure. It kept Capone contained. By forcing Torrio out, Weiss didn't weaken the South Side. Weiss assumed that chaos would fracture Capone's operation the way it fractured others. Instead, it liberated him. Capone didn't need Torrio's approval to escalate. He needed Torrio gone. This is the recurring mistake in power struggles built on violence. Eliminating the moderating force doesn't end conflict, it accelerates it. The most dangerous person in the room is rarely the strategist. It's the one waiting for permission to stop holding back. Weiss thought he was ending a war. What he actually did was authorize the next phase. Weiss watched what happened next and drew a hard conclusion. Capone wasn't restrained by Torrio. He was contained by him. Once Torrio was gone, Weiss saw Capone begin operating without brakes, faster retaliation, more public violence, less interest in negotiation. The war stopped being about territory and started being about survival. From that point on, Weiss didn't see Capone as a rival to be pressured or negotiated with. He saw him as an existential threat, a man whose leadership style guaranteed endless escalation. So Weiss recalibrated. If Torrio was the system, Capone was the accelerant, and accelerants don't burn out on their own. That's why Weiss didn't settle for disrupting Capone's business. That's why he didn't aim for underlings or territory. He went after Capone himself. By late 1926, Hymie Weiss had reached a conclusion he hadn't wanted to reach. From Weiss's perspective, there were only two outcomes now. Capone lived, and the war never ended. Or Capone died, and the system reset. That's when Weiss decided the target had to move up. Capone's base of operations was the Lexington Hotel on 22nd Street. It wasn't a secret. Everyone knew it. Capone held court there openly, confident that visibility and protection made him untouchable. Weiss saw the flaw in that confidence. On September 20th, 1926, Weiss positioned gunmen across the street from the hotel, using elevation and distance to their advantage. This wasn't a street ambush. It was an assassination attempt designed to end the war in seconds. They waited. When Capone stepped outside the Lexington, the street was ordinary. Cars moving, pedestrians passing, no warning in the air. Then the rifles opened up. Gunfire ripped across the street, shattering hotel windows and tearing into the building's facade. Bullets sparked off brick and glass. People screamed and scattered. Bodyguards reacted instantly, dragging Capone back inside as shots continued to punch through the space he had occupied moments earlier. It was chaos, but it was controlled chaos. Weiss's men weren't spraying bullets. They were aiming. Capone survived by seconds. Had he paused? Had he taken one more step, had his guards reacted a moment slower, the war would have ended right there. The attempt failed for 3 reasons. First, timing. Weiss caught Capone in motion, not fixed in place. Assassination requires certainty. Movement introduces variables. Second, protection. Capone's security detail reacted faster than Weiss anticipated. They didn't return fire immediately. They shielded and extracted. That saved his life. Third, and most important, survival changed Capone. Capone didn't walk away shaken. He walked away resolved. The Lexington Hotel attack told him something Weiss had hoped to avoid. This wasn't pressure anymore. This was extermination. And once that line was crossed, Capone abandoned any remaining restraint. Weiss had been right about one thing. Capone did have to die for the war to end. But by missing, Weiss sealed his own fate. He revealed both his intent and his capability. From that moment on, Capone stopped reacting and started hunting. Less than a month later, Weiss would be dead, executed outside Holy Name Cathedral in broad daylight. The man who came closest to killing Capone didn't fail because his logic was flawed. He failed because violence, once escalated, only gives you one chance, and Weiss missed it. Capone didn't choose a back alley. He didn't choose a speakeasy. He chose Holy Name Cathedral, and that choice was deliberate. Holy Name Cathedral sat at the intersection of power, respectability, and routine. Weiss attended services there regularly. His movements were predictable. There were no armed guards scanning rooftops, no suspicion, no readiness for violence. Capone understood something Weiss hadn't accounted for. Routine kills faster than bravado. On October 11, 1926, Weiss exited Holy Name Cathedral after Mass. The street was calm. People were coming and going. Cars idled. The city was breathing normally. Then gunmen opened fire from across the street. This wasn't an ambush meant to intimidate. It was an execution meant to end a chapter. Weiss was struck multiple times. He collapsed on the sidewalk in front of one of Chicago's most prominent religious institutions, bleeding out in public view. His bodyguards returned fire, but the shooters were already withdrawing. Planned routes, practiced timing, no hesitation. Within minutes, it was over. The man who had come closest to killing Capone lay dead beneath Cathedral Stone. Now let's do a psychological analysis of Hymie. With what we know from history, we can analyze Weiss's patterns of behavior, how Weiss responded to power, threat, and escalation compared to his counterparts. That's where Weiss becomes interesting. Weiss presents as highly controlled, outcome-oriented, and unusually disciplined for a gang leader of the early 1920s. Unlike many contemporaries, he did not appear impulsive or ego-driven. His behavior showed delayed gratification, strategic patience, and a low need for validation. These traits alone put him ahead of most leaders of his time. Weiss didn't enjoy violence in the way figures like Capone appear to. He used it instrumentally. A key distinction is Capone escalated to assert dominance, where Weiss escalated to end systems. He selected targets that would change the structure of power, not just satisfy revenge. That's why he went after Torrio first. That's why he pivoted to Capone next. This suggests a psychology focused on resolution, not expression. For the era, Weiss demonstrated advanced systems thinking. He correctly identified Torrio as a moderating force and Capone as an accelerant. That insight was rare at the time and shows abstract reasoning beyond immediate street survival. Psychologically, this places Weiss closer to a strategist than a traditional gang enforcer. Weiss's psychological blind spot wasn't arrogance. It was overconfidence in rational outcomes. This reflects a managerial mindset applied to chaos. Weiss underestimated how power reacts when fear becomes identity. He didn't fully account for Capone's need for dominance, spectacle, and retaliation beyond rational cost-benefit analysis. In short, Weiss assumed others played by rules he himself followed. They didn't. Weiss was willing to expose himself personally, attending church publicly, maintaining routine, which suggests either a strong confidence in operational security or a belief that predictability reduced risk. Psychologically, this signals trust in order, even within disorder. That belief ultimately failed him. Capone exploited that assumption mercilessly. Weiss came closer to stopping Capone than anyone else because his psychology was aligned with decisive action rather than prolonged conflict. Hymie Weiss wasn't undone by stupidity, emotion, or ego. He was undone by being too rational in an irrational environment. There's a brutal truth here. The smarter you are, the earlier you become a priority. Violent hierarchies don't reward insight, they eliminate it. They don't tolerate people who see the board clearly. They remove them before others learn to see the same way. Weiss believed escalation could still be managed if applied precisely. Capone believed escalation was the point. And in a world where fear is currency, the man willing to spend it endlessly always outlasts the man trying to control it. So Weiss died not because he was wrong, but because he was right too early in a system that hadn't yet reached its breaking point. The smartest guy still dies when intelligence threatens power instead of serving it. And that's the real lesson of Weiss's story. When Hymie Weiss was killed, the North Side didn't collapse. It hollowed out. Leadership passed not to the smartest man in the room, but to the one who was still standing. And that man was Bugs Moran. Moran was born George Clarence Moran in 1891 in St. Paul, Minnesota, the son of Irish immigrants. He wasn't Chicago-born like O'Banion, and he didn't rise out of 5 points like Weiss. He came up drifting, petty crime, robberies, early jail time, a background defined less by ambition than by endurance. That matters. Moran wasn't shaped by strategy. Physically, Moran didn't look like a kingpin. He was stocky, compact, with a blunt face and hard-set eyes that never fully relaxed. No movie star charisma, no theatrical presence. He dressed plainly, blended easily, and carried himself like a man who expected trouble and planned to duck it rather than dominate it. Where Weiss was deliberate and Capone was expansive, Moran was reactive. Moran wasn't smart enough to outmaneuver Al Capone, and he wasn't powerful enough to challenge him head-on, but he was careful, stubborn, and most importantly, still alive. And survival in this phase of the war was enough to keep it going. Moran didn't try to run Chicago. He tried to bleed it. He hijacked shipments, disrupted distribution, and hit Capone's operation at the edges, just enough to stay relevant, never enough to present a clean target. He didn't keep a fixed headquarters. He didn't hold court. He moved constantly, avoided routines, and trusted almost no one. That made him infuriating. Capone could eliminate leaders, he could intimidate crews, he could buy cops and politicians. What he couldn't do was force Moran into a decisive confrontation, and that's the problem. Wars based on dominance require a visible enemy. Moran refused to be one. He kept the conflict alive simply by not dying, and that prolonged exposure was dangerous in a way Weiss never was. From Capone's perspective, Moran represented three unacceptable risks. First, persistence. As long as Moran lived, hijackings continued. Violence stayed in the news. The war never closed. Second, unpredictability. Moran didn't follow patterns. You can't assassinate a man who doesn't reliably show up. Third, and most critical, attention. Every unresolved conflict brought scrutiny. Every shooting hardened the federal gaze. Moran didn't need to win. He just needed to make sure the bleeding didn't stop. That's when Capone made a different calculation. If you can't reach the survivor, you eliminate the environment he survives in. Capone stopped trying to kill Moran directly and decided instead to destroy his operation in one move, to decapitate it so completely that survival itself became meaningless. That required deception, scale, and finality. It required an act so definitive that there would be no retaliation, no confusion about who now controlled Chicago, and no remaining infrastructure for Moran to operate through. That decision leads straight to a cold February morning in 1929. A rented garage, men who thought they were attending a routine transaction, and uniforms that turned compliance into a death sentence. Valentine's Day didn't happen because Capone was reckless. It happened because Moran was still there. And in wars built on fear, the man who refuses to disappear eventually forces the most brutal solution on the table. On the morning of February 14th, 1929, Bugs Moran was supposed to be inside the garage on North Clark Street. He wasn't late because of carelessness. He was late because of instinct. As Moran approached the garage, he spotted something that stopped him cold. Men he believed were police officers entering the building. In Prohibition-era Chicago, that wasn't unusual. Raids were constant. But Moran had survived this long by reading rooms before walking into them, and something felt off. Instead of continuing forward, Moran turned away. He didn't run. He didn't confront anyone. He simply backed out of the situation and disappeared down the street. That decision, made in seconds, saved his life. Inside the garage, Capone's gunmen relied on a critical assumption that Moran would see uniforms and comply. Everyone else did. They lined up against the wall because that's what you did when police showed up. Moran never made it that far. By the time the gunmen opened fire, Moran was already gone. Close enough that he later said he heard what sounded like a truck backfiring. Far enough that he couldn't be tied to the scene. Capone's plan didn't fail because it was sloppy. It failed because it depended on predictable behavior. And Moran, unlike O'Banion or Weiss, had learned to survive by not being predictable. That's the irony at the center of Valentine's Day. The least effective leader, the least strategic thinker, the man who never tried to dominate Chicago was the one who lived. Moran didn't outsmart Capone. He outlived him by minutes. And in a war built on fear, sometimes that's enough. But survival didn't mean victory. It meant exposure. The massacre didn't just wipe out Moran's top lieutenants. It destroyed his operating environment. 7 bodies on a concrete floor ended any tolerance Chicago had left for gang warfare. The public recoiled. Newspapers screamed. And crucially, federal agencies that had stayed peripheral moved in. Moran's operation was suddenly radioactive. His political protection evaporated. Police who once took envelopes now took statements. Informants who'd stayed quiet started talking. Businesses that had tolerated North Side pressure cut ties overnight. Moran didn't lose power because Capone beat him in the street. He lost it because the system around him collapsed, and Moran had no fallback. Unlike Al Capone, Moran didn't build diversified revenue streams. He didn't cultivate national alliances. He didn't create layers of insulation. His leadership style, reactive, mobile, survival-based, kept him alive, but it never built resilience. Hijackings became desperate instead of strategic. Associates defected or disappeared. Then came the quiet humiliation. While Capone was fighting the federal government, Moran was reduced to small-time crime. In the 1930s and 40s, he bounced through a series of armed robbery convictions, serving time not as a feared boss, but as a repeat offender. No protection, no influence, no leverage. By the time Moran died in 1957, he was broke, forgotten, and buried without ceremony. A man who had outlived the war but lost everything it had ever promised him. That's the final irony of Bugs Moran. He escaped the most famous gang execution in American history and still ended up with nothing. No empire, no myth, no redemption, because survival alone doesn't preserve power. In violent systems, you either adapt into something sustainable or you live long enough to watch the ground disappear beneath you. Moran's psychology was built around avoidance, distrust, and survival, not dominance or control. Unlike Capone or Weiss, he didn't crave authority or validation. He wasn't trying to win the war, he was trying to not die in it. Where Weiss thought in systems and Capone thought in spectacle, Moran thought in escape routes. This made him hard to kill and impossible to build with. Moran avoided risk well enough to survive Valentine's Day, but that same psychology prevented him from creating stability, loyalty, or resilience. He distrusted centralized power, avoided visibility, and never fully committed to expansion. Psychologically, he was operating in permanent crisis mode. That's the paradox of Moran. His instincts kept him alive in the short term, but they dismantled his future. The North Side Gang didn't fall because of one bad decision. It fell because three very different men each embodied a different way power fails. Dean O'Banion believed chaos was leverage. He broke agreements, lied to rivals, and destabilized the system on purpose, convinced that unpredictability would keep him untouchable. Psychologically, he thrived on manipulation and disruption, but chaos has a shelf life. When the system finally responded, it erased him quickly and decisively. Hymie Weiss believed intelligence could end violence. He was disciplined, strategic, and clearer-eyed than almost anyone else in the Chicago War. He correctly identified the real threats and moved decisively to eliminate them. But Weiss made a fatal assumption that violence could still be contained once used precisely. In a system sliding toward total fear-based rule, being the smartest man in the room only made him the first priority to remove. Bugs Moran believed survival was enough. He avoided routines, dodged death, and outlived every major confrontation, but his psychology was built entirely around escape, not construction. He didn't lose because Capone beat him. He lost because survival without strategy leaves nothing behind. When the war ended, Moran was still alive and completely irrelevant. Together, they tell the same story from three angles. Chaos burns fast. Intelligence threatens power. Survival alone doesn't build a future. None of these men were stupid. None of them were weak. And none of them won. Because in systems ruled by fear, there are no lasting victories, only different ways of losing. And that's the truth the mythology leaves out. You've been listening to Deadly Truths with Becca. If you want to go deeper into Al Capone's downfall, Alcatraz, untreated syphilis, and the slow collapse that fear never prevents, check out the 2 other full episodes I did on Al Capone or other mob figures throughout history on this podcast. If this episode gave you a clearer picture of how power actually works, how chaos, intelligence, and survival all fail in violent systems, take a moment to follow the show, leave a review, and share it with someone who cares about history without the mythology. It's the fastest way to keep independent, research-driven storytelling alive. A quick note for clarity, this episode is based on historical records, court documents, contemporary reporting, and established scholarship. Psychological analysis is interpretive, not diagnostic, and is offered to understand behavior, not excuse it. Thank you to my listeners who value context, accountability, and truth over legend. And remember, the truth isn't dead, it's just buried.